True crime cases are sometimes solved years or even decades later. New criminal investigators, additional crime scene evidence, and updated witness testimonies can lead to a cold case eventually being solved much later. And that's despite all the problems forensic science teams and other criminal investigators often face while extracting justice. Number 5. Janet Ann Taylor was last seen alive on March 24, 1970. At about 7:05 p.m., a motorist near Lagunitas Lake at Stanford University passed Janet as she hitchhiked at an intersection. When the same motorist came back 25 minutes later, Janet was gone. It was the start of a cold case that wouldn't be solved for more than 50 years. Janet was 21 years old at the time of her mysterious disappearance. She lived in La Honda, but her car was in the garage that night. Her close friend and ex-boyfriend Russell drove her to her job in town, then went to work by himself. After work, Janet caught up with an old friend, Debbie, on the Stanford campus. She planned to hitchhike home rather than walk to feed her dog sooner. Russell wasn't too worried when he came back from work and found Janet missing, reasoning that she was with Debbie. But by the next day, he was worried enough to go out and look for her with a friend. Sadly, Janet's body had already been found. A milkman driving down Sand Hill Road spotted Janet's body in a ditch with torn clothing and missing shoes that were later found a little further down the road. Janet had used her martial arts training to defend herself against a much more powerful attacker, which likely led to her ripped clothes. Almost immediately, it seemed like the criminal investigation into Janet's case went cold. She was the daughter of a former Stanford athletic director, so the unsolved case got a fair bit of media attention, and it wasn't the first cold case of its kind in the area. Another 21-year-old woman had gone missing just over a year earlier in 1973. True crime reports indicate Leslie Perlov was found on February 16, 1973, in a seldom traveled area of Palo Alto. This was just across county lines, which now meant that two different police forces were investigating these cold case files. Connections were made between the two unsolved cases, but there were enough differences that police couldn't say for sure that the same criminal was responsible. At one point, investigators described a man who was near the site where Janet was found. A passerby had asked if he had car troubles, as he was standing next to his car at 12:15 a.m., hours before Janet's body was found. The nervous man responded that he did not, and the witness drove away. An appeal for the man was made in local newspapers, and it was a mystery as to whether or not anybody came forward and explained their strange behavior. A year after the disturbing true crime, police believed they got a break in the case when residents of what was described as a commuter-type home found a stash of newspaper clippings about Janet's case, as well as a photo of a young woman they believed to be Janet. The evidence had been left by another resident who has since disappeared. He also left behind disturbing letters, including one that said something always happens to my girlfriends. It wasn't until 2016, decades later, that the cold case would be on its way to eventually getting solved. That year, investigators in the Leslie Perlov cold case had taken scrapings from beneath Leslie's fingernails to create a DNA profile of the person who attacked her. 2 years later, using genetic genealogy, forensic investigators determined the DNA evidence was tied to a man named John Gertrude. Gertrude had been in his late 20s at the time of these unsolved mysteries, and had been a technician at Stanford University. A DNA sample was discreetly taken from a used coffee cup, and in 2018, criminal investigators confirmed that Gertrude was a match for the sample taken from beneath Leslie's fingernails at the crime scene. Janet's cold case was also reopened, and her clothes were re-examined. DNA evidence was found on a ripped piece of her pants. When tested, forensic investigators matched the DNA to Gertrude. Gertrude was taken in for an interrogation, initially just on Leslie's cold case files. Contradicting statements showed that he knew more about the crime scene evidence than he should have, and he even allegedly said as much. When interrogated about Leslie's case, He also mentioned another girl, which was believed to be Janet. Gertrude tried to backpack, claiming that the portrait of Leslie he was shown didn't look like the crime scene photo. In 2019, Gertrude was charged in Janet's case. Even though it was originally Leslie's case he was interrogated for, it would be Janet's that went to court first. In court, a disturbing backstory was painted. Gertrude's family had only known him as a kind and loving father and grandfather. They were shocked to hear about his dark history, including a conviction for taking a life in Germany when he was 18. He had also been accused of more attacks after he had returned to the United States. Gertrude's defense team tried to argue that the DNA evidence on the pants could have been the result of cross-contamination. The procedures for forensic evidence in the 1970s weren't as good as they are today, and all of Janet's clothing was stored in the same bag. It could be argued that the DNA on Janet's pants could have come from elsewhere on her clothing. However, that still wouldn't have explained how any of his DNA got onto Janet's clothing in the first place. It took the jury less than an hour to convict Gertrude of taking Janet's life. He was sentenced to 7 years to life in prison. At 77 years old, he will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. He's still awaiting trial in Leslie's case. The trial was delayed due to a medical incident for Gertrude, but Leslie's family are determined for the case to be heard in court. Leslie's sister stated that she wanted people to know the truth about the criminal responsible for taking Leslie's life. Gertrude has since pleaded not guilty. Number 4. In September of 1972, 2 college students on their way back to university stumbled across a disturbing true crime scene along the Pennsylvania Turnpike. 2 young men found the body of a missing man lying face down in a ditch just out of view of the road. The person was identified as Morgan Peters Jr., who by then had been missing for a few days. The traveling gym equipment salesman was last seen sometime around 2 a.m. on September 18th, after he had a meal at a truck stop where he was a regular and told them that he was heading towards Pittsburgh on business. Morgan was actually on his way to Latrobe, where he was scheduled to fit gym equipment. He'd left his wife and children at his New York home the evening before he was last seen. It wouldn't be until Tuesday that Morgan was reported as a missing person case to police. Investigators had already found his red pickup abandoned near mile marker 171.6, and with several windows smashed from both sides and inside, it looked like a crime scene. The following day, Morgan's body was found near mile marker 189.2. There were no signs of footprints or tire marks at the crime scene where the body was found, and police didn't believe Morgan had been pushed out of a moving vehicle. Forensic ballistics determined a small caliber round had gone into his bag. There was about $200 in Morgan's pocket, but missing were his wallet, an expensive watch, and a portable radio. They couldn't say why his vehicle was found so far from the body, but investigators believed that the robbery was a likely motive and that this true crime had been completely random. To further add to the mystery, witnesses reported seeing a vehicle that matched the description of Morgan's truck, with 2 blonde women standing outside of it. Nothing ever came of the tip, and the case soon went cold until police had a suspect in mind. The same day that Morgan's body was found, a young woman named Jane McGuire had also lost her life in Ohio via 3.25 caliber rounds. The case was later connected to an attack on a gas station owner named Harvey Hoffman, which had happened in Ohio in September. Harvey had stopped to help a man and a woman at the side of the road, both with long blonde hair. They'd run out of gas, so he took them back to his gas station. Once there, the woman tied Harvey up, and the 2 criminals stole cash from the register. He was found wandering around in confusion after they made an unsuccessful attempt on his life with a small caliber round. Criminal investigators linked the cases because they used the same ammunition and the same weapon. The crimes were tied to a man named Larry Villa and his accomplice Charmaine Bouvard. Villa was a wannabe rock star who tried to sell his poetry to rock bands in Cleveland. One of his many seedy hangouts is where he met Bouvard as a go-go dancer. In the middle of the night in May of 1972, Vaya left his wife to travel from state to state with Bouvard, leaving nothing more than a note that he was going someplace to clear his head. Bouvard purchased a weapon which used .25 caliber bullets, and she later told crime detectives that she bought it for her own protection, allegedly showing it to Vaya once and never seeing it again. They traveled across Ohio and Pennsylvania, committing a string of robberies and darker crimes, including the crimes against Janet McGuire and Harvey Hoffman. Afterwards, Vaya returned to his wife to hide from the police, but it wasn't long before he was caught wearing Morgan's watch and had his wallet. Vaya was sentenced to life in prison for taking Janet's life, while Bouvard served a shorter sentence for her part in the crime against Harvey. At the time, the two criminals weren't tied to Morgan's unsolved case, even though their long blonde hair meant that they might have been the two women the witnesses saw with Morgan's truck, and the fact that he had Morgan's missing belongings seemed to indicate there was some connection. But in 2009, when the case was re-examined, it was suggested that Vaya might have been the person responsible for taking Morgan's life. Bouvard had since changed her name to Phillips and had moved on with her life. Now she wanted to tip police off to another true crime she believed Vaya had been involved with. In September of 1972, Vaya had told her to pull over while they were in Pennsylvania. According to Bouvard, she'd waited in the Cadillac with her two dogs while he disappeared. He came back driving a red pickup truck and was in a hurry. They fled the scene, abandoned the truck, and left in her Cadillac. An investigator looking at the cold case found an unusual note that could help solve the mystery. It looked like Vaya had found some success as an author. While behind bars, he had some of his writings published in biker magazines. 3 crime stories stood out to investigators in particular. 2 were very similar to the crimes Vaya had already been found guilty of, which meant that the third might be similar to the truth as well. The story was called Dangerous Dave. In one scene, a female hitchhiker unknowingly lures a motorist to an armed man hiding in the trees. Investigators figured this was a little too similar to what they thought had happened to Morgan. In 2019, Vaya was charged with the crime and still awaits trial. He remains behind bars for the earlier conviction in the case of Janet McGuire. Number 3. For more than 50 years, what happened to Everett Delano on the morning of September 1st, 1966, remained a strange mystery. By the time it was reopened in 2013, it was the oldest unsolved case in New Hampshire, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Everett, the victim in this cold case, was a Navy veteran. He had served in the Pacific during the Second World War and continued to be stationed there in the post-war period. It wasn't until 1964 that he retired and tried to settle into civilian life. Everett worked 2 jobs to keep busy and support his small New Hampshire family: an overnight security guard at the Colby Sawyer College in New London, but he also did shifts at a gas station and a mechanic shop in a small town of Andover. This gas station also housed the town post office and was owned by a friend named Kenneth Sanborn. On the day of the crime, Kenneth left Everett at the station alone for his first time at 8:50 a.m. because he had some errands to run. A friend spotted Everett at 9:25 reversing a car, and she waved as she passed. Everett waved back, and in the next 10 minutes, a violent true crime would happen. Between 9:25 and 9:35, an unknown person somehow got into the small office where Everett was working and demanded money from the cash register. The criminal managed to get away with about $90 and let loose 5 rounds, one into the ceiling, another into Everett's arm, stopping his watch at 9:35 a.m., and 3 more in the head. Everett was miraculously still alive when the criminal left. It was believed that the criminal was disturbed as he left the water faucet running. Shortly after, a customer waited for 10 minutes at the pump for service until she left. By 10 a.m., 2 groups of men had arrived and were concerned when they couldn't find Everett. One man peered into the office and found Everett on the floor. He passed away at the hospital. Police at the time took great care of the crime scene. The most important clue found would be fingerprints left on the faucet that most likely belonged to the culprit. The fingerprints were sent to the FBI, while police detectives continued to work in Andover. Hundreds of people were interviewed as police searched for witnesses. One person had heard the weapon being used, but nobody had seen who was responsible. Everyone who had recently purchased a weapon that used the same caliber bullets had their weapons collected and tested. The tests didn't give police any more leads. The weapons had not been discarded in any near waterways either. The case went cold until much later when Everett's daughter brought the case to the attention of investigators in 2013, and it was finally reopened. From that point, the case was solved surprisingly quickly. The work detectives did in 1966 allowed modern investigators to identify a suspect within months. Agents simply had to put the fingerprints through the FBI's integrated automated fingerprint identification system. And as soon as they did, FBI investigators got a match on the files. Thomas Cass had a prison record, including armed robberies and grand theft auto. His ex-wife had to get a restraining order against him. By the time investigators caught up with him, he was 67 years old and living with a girlfriend in Orleans, Vermont. Cass admitted to his criminal history, but claimed he had never heard of the town of Andover. He said he had only been to New Hampshire once, despite having multiple run-ins with the law there, and he was never at the crime scene of Everett. A DNA sample from Cass did not help forensic investigators, nor did a cigarette butt and some hair that had been recovered from the crime scene. But fingerprints from the FBI's files were enough for investigators to link Cass to the crime scene and the crime itself. In a surprise visit in February of 2014, Cass was told there was forensic evidence linking him to the crime, and a search of the house took place. Given the amount of time that had passed since the crime, it was unsurprising that no weapon was located. 4 days after the February visit, Cass passed away before he could be taken into custody. His girlfriend said that he had most likely taken his own life because he didn't want to go back to prison. He hadn't given a criminal confession before he passed, but did ominously say that he wouldn't talk about any crime that didn't have a statute of limitations. Investigators believed that they had enough to conclusively say Cass was responsible for the true crime that had taken place in September of 1966. It took another 5 years for the report to be prepared, due to staffing issues, but in 2019, the case was finally closed. Number 2. It was a cool November morning in 1981 when Evelyn Laverne Mackey vanished without a trace. Laverne was a 41-year-old mother of 2 living in Hernando County, Florida, with her husband and daughter. Her mysterious disappearance would become a cold case that would be unsolved for more than 30 years. 2 years earlier, Laverne had met Merle Mackey while she was a recently divorced single mother of 2 kids. Merle had a criminal history that he convinced her was all in the past, mostly fraud cases, but also for more serious crimes like grand theft auto. They married within months. He gradually manipulated her into giving control over her finances and property deeds, eventually moving Laverne and her daughter Kelly into a trailer far away with no phone in 1981. By then, Laverne's son had already been kicked out of the house after being accused of stealing from Merle, further isolating her from her family. On November 5th of that year, Merle had come to pick up Kelly from school without Laverne, which was strange, but he told Kelly that her mother was watching her uncle, who had fallen sick, and that she had left to catch a flight. Kelly grew suspicious and called her uncle. He said he hadn't spoken for Laverne in months, to which Merle admitted to lying. He said that Laverne had run off with another man and wasn't coming back. When Kelly went to live with her biological father and her stepmother came to collect her belongings, they found that Laverne hadn't packed up at all or taken anything with her when she disappeared. All of her belongings, including her cosmetics, were still at the trailer. In January of the following year, the rest of Laverne's family had her reported as a missing person. As a main suspect in her disappearance, Merle told multiple different stories throughout the criminal investigation that included everything from extramarital affairs to missionary work. Investigators found money had been withdrawn from the account Merle and Laverne shared until it was empty. As both had access to the account, There was no way of knowing if this was Laverne paying for her new lifestyle, or Merle removing the money himself. After a search of the trailer turned up nothing, the case went cold until much later in 2014. Sergeant Phil Lincoln attended a seminar at the National Homicide Conference that year, where he made contact with Kelly Siegler, the host of the TV show Cold Justice. He pitched Laverne's case, and investigators on the TV show took on the case. They concluded Laverne was no longer alive, and there was only one suspect in the unsolved disappearance. Merle's contradicting stories were circumstantial evidence that would stand up in court if he was ever sent to trial. The problem investigators faced was that the evidence would only be usable if the police officers who took the statements could be cross-examined during the trial. Both of the police officers had since passed away. A search of the trailer where Laverne and Merle lived turned up no forensic evidence, and it seemed like the only way that Merle would ever face justice was if he authenticated his past statements again. The cold case team eventually tried a strange method to get him to speak to them. Knowing he was a grifter, investigators told Merle someone matching Laverne's description had passed away in a plane crash in South America. If it was confirmed to be Laverne, he would be entitled to financial compensation. However, they needed to go over his statements again. He eventually authenticated all the stories he had told. When the contradictions were pointed out, he refused to cooperate. That's when interrogators said that he was looking at charges for taking Laverne's life in a premeditated fashion. Finally, Merle confessed to taking Laverne's life, but said that it hadn't been intentional. According to him, the story behind his crime was that he and Laverne had gone fishing that day. Laverne fell headfirst into the dock and wasn't breathing. Rather than getting help, Merle decided to tie Laverne to an anchor and throw her off the dock. He showed police the area where they had gone fishing, but police believed it would be impossible for Laverne's missing body to ever be found, if it was even there. Merle eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Number 1. In October of 1970, Nancy Bennallack was preparing for her wedding to Sacramento's chief public defender, Ferris Salami. The wedding was scheduled for the following month, and Nancy was getting ready to spend the rest of her life with Ferris. But in a devastating true crime, that would be stolen away from her when someone took her life in a brutal attack early on October 26th. The night before, Nancy and Ferris had gone on a night out. They returned to Nancy's second-floor apartment at Tahitian Apartments at about 11:30 p.m. It was just 7 months since another young woman, Judith Ann Wakari, had been kidnapped from outside her apartment, just a block away from Nancy's home. Her body was found a month later, and the person responsible was never found. But neither Nancy nor Ferris were thinking about the cold case that night. Nancy was already fast asleep when Ferris left, not long after he had brought her home. The front door to the apartment was locked behind him, but he knew the sliding glass door that led to Nancy's balcony was open a bit. Nancy liked to keep it open so her cat could come and go as it wanted. Ferris returned home and would never see his fiancée alive again. The next day was a Monday. Nancy was expected at the local juvenile center, where she worked as a court reporter. Her coworker and friend, Joella Moncrief, was worried when she hadn't shown up for work. She hadn't left a message to say that she was sick, and it was very strange for Nancy to not show up. Joella sent her son Jack to check on Nancy and to make sure she was okay. Jack managed to convince the apartment manager to open Nancy's apartment so that they could check on her. It was then that Nancy's body was found. She was lying beside her bed and had dozens of wounds caused by a sharp object. Police wasted no time in beginning the criminal investigation. The culprit was believed to have watched Nancy for some time and knew how to get into her apartment. They climbed onto a gas meter at the back of the building, which led them to get high enough to reach up into Nancy's balcony. They pulled themselves up and climbed onto the balcony before letting themselves into the apartment. It was believed the crime took place sometime in the early hours of the morning, possibly around 2 a.m. Police determined that the culprit had to be someone agile for them to be able to get onto the balcony at night. At some point before or during the attack, Nancy woke and tried to fight off her attacker. Looking at the wounds on her hand, it seemed like at one point she managed to take the weapon that was being used against her. The criminal was hurt, but Nancy wasn't able to save her own life. The wound that she inflicted may not have been enough to save her life, but it did give police vital evidence to try to crack the case. At the crime scene, they found a trail of blood leading to the balcony. The trail continued onto the ground, all the way to the parking lot where it vanished. Police determined that the criminal had gotten into a vehicle and fled the scene. Other evidence found at the crime scene were pieces of masking tape. It appeared that the criminal had put tape on their fingers to try to cover up their fingerprints. Whether this was because tape was more easily available than gloves or because they didn't want to wear gloves was never discovered. But it was effective in making sure that there were no fingerprints on the balcony or elsewhere in the apartment. But a few pieces of tape had come off during the attack, and the lead investigator at the crime scene carefully collected them. They were placed in a bag on a folder, but the technician didn't realize their importance and closed the folder on top of them, crushing the tape and destroying any fingerprints that may have been uncovered. Investigators still had DNA from the trail, but in 1970 there was little they could do with it. More than 300 people were interviewed as part of the investigation to crack the case. Most were residents from the apartment complex. Some would even have been able to see the crime scene from their apartments on the other side of the complex's pool. But nobody saw anyone sneaking in or out of Nancy's apartment that day. Nancy's fiance was quickly ruled out as a suspect, and with no obvious culprit, the case went cold. Over the years, Nancy's case was connected to other crimes, and by the end of 1970, 3 young women in the area had lost their lives and their cases remained unsolved. As well as Nancy and Judith Hakari, another woman named Carol Hilburn had also been kidnapped and had her life taken from her in November of that year. Investigators, both professional and amateur, connected Nancy and Judith's cases. It wasn't only the fact that the 2 crimes were very close together that led to a connection being made. Nancy and Judith had some physical similarities too. Both were young women working professional jobs. Judith was a nurse. They both had dark hair and a slightly protruding lip, according to news reports at the time. They were both also attacked on a weekend. Both were engaged, though neither had made the public announcements in the newspapers. They found some key differences though. Not only was Judith kidnapped, she was also attacked by a blunt object rather than the sharp object Nancy was attacked with. Police couldn't find any evidence to connect the 2 cases, but it didn't stop people from speculating. At one point, it was even suggested that Nancy and Judith might both have been victims of the Zodiac killer. This is mostly due to 2 letters sent by the Zodiac at the end of 1969. The infamous criminal, who was active throughout California at the time, stated in his letter that the state is in trouble. I will go for government life. It was widely understood this referred to police officers, but Nancy and Judith could have fit that profile. At the bottom of the letter was a list of places in California, and beside each number which indicated how many times he would strike there. He said he would strike in Sacramento 9 times. There was no other evidence that either crime was committed by the Zodiac killer though, and neither woman was officially linked to the case. Nancy's case remained cold for decades, but in 2004, DNA that was taken from the crime scene was analyzed, and a DNA profile for the male culprit was created. The profile was uploaded to various databases to see if there was a match, but nothing came up. It wasn't until 2019 that the technology was finally available for authorities to crack this case. Using genetic genealogy, the Sacramento Cold Case Unit was able to identify a relative of the criminal responsible for taking Nancy's life. That relative was then approached in person and gave another DNA sample that would confirm that they were the relative of the criminal. After that was confirmed, police identified a man named Richard John Davis as the criminal. Davis had been 27 years old in 1970 and living with a roommate in an apartment across the pool from Nancy's. He was in one of the apartments that allowed him to look in on Nancy's home. At the time of the crime, both he and his roommate were questioned, but police never noticed any wounds to Davis's hand or arm, something they were looking out for after spotting the trail. Davis passed away in 1997, and didn't have any other contact with police other than a DUI arrest. What motive he had for taking Nancy's life remains unknown. Judith Hikari's case remains a mystery. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.